Okay, so are we ready to jump in? Let's rock and roll. All right. Okay, so if you don't have this example code here, I have it on a flash drive. Okay, so if you need access, I think I gave it to everyone, but if you need that, so basically to kickstart a new RESTExpress project, we have a RESTExpress Scaffold Project, and it's pretty simple. It expands on the example that we looked at, and injects a few things, of course. Those 90 files you have to have in order to get started. Really all you need is your domain object. You need your main and then a controller. It's really all you need. But we've found, of course, that for a real rich application, you have to have more than that, right? So we built this scaffolding app, and it supports the CRUD operations on a single order domain object. So it pulls in all the Mongo repositories and the configuration that we use and an example controller. And then, so what we're going to do is use that as our template to expand for our blogging system. So does everybody have this scaffold.zip file expanded? Does anybody need it? Everybody got it? Okay. So if you expand that out, it ends up looking something like this. So it has two directories, a complete directory, which is a reference implementation that, is basically everything that we will do today and maybe then some. And then there's the Kickstart directory, and that's the one we'll be building on. So I happen to have it here in pulled into Eclipse. I'll just expand this out here and then we can talk about it a little bit. All right. So in essence, in my Java source, we've got our main, and that's just has just a little block of code in it to define the server, the port that we want to listen on. And it defines the routes that this server is going to support, and we'll go in there in just a second. But we've decided to not use Spring. Some of our projects use Juice, but we just a lot of times Spring comes along with a lot of weight. So we still use the principles of being able to inject things, so it's a lot of interface-driven design. But our configuration file, really all we have to have is database connections and our controllers, and those get stitched up. So here's our order controller. This guy is here to support linking of this order. Hypermedia linking. This is for our caching plugin. These are for serialization in case we wanted to tweak them, because a lot of times projects will have their own custom serializers. But really all we care about when we are creating our blog is we want to add routes here, we want a new controller, and we want our our domain object. So that's pretty minimal for what we'll have to do. Of course, we'll have to stitch stuff together in our configuration. If you were using Spring, you'd have to stitch that together in XML anyway, right? So let's see how snazzy PowerPoint is here with getting back to where we thought we were. All right. So is everybody ready with their development environment? They have Mongo installed and projects pulled into Eclipse, or everybody that cares? So are we all set then? So if you go into that blogging directory, Kickstart directory, I have Mongo running already. So if you go into the Kickstart directory and you do an ant run, you should see something along these lines. So our scaffolding is running on port 8081. So I should be able to come over here with the Chrome REST client and say HTTP localhost 8081 orders. And it sends me back an empty list of orders. So we all set to create our first domain model. I'm going to move on. If you have a question or whatever, feel free to stop me. So let's do this. Let's just, we already talked about the project structure a little bit. All right, let's jump into creating our first domain object. Basically, we're going to support /blogs.format. RESTExpress uses a URL language much like RESTlet or Rails, to where you specify a path, and this is a parameter that gets substituted in your URL. The dot format, RESTExpress supports .json and .xml out of the box, because that's really quite visible. Instead of having to set, you don't have to do content type negotiation on everything. And we use curl to test a lot, so it's just easier to put .json on the back. A lot of people would argue that's not RESTful, because you're getting a different resource back or different representation back based on a different URL. After testing a Rails app, we liked that you could do the dot format. It's very visible. It's easy to use. So if you don't like it, you could just eliminate the dot and the format parameter at the end of your URL. Anyway, we're going to support a /blogs. If we post to it, we'll create a new blog. If we get from it, we'll get a list of blogs. And then blogs / particular blog ID. We're going to offer get, put, and delete on that to do operations on a specific blog. So we have to create the blog. We have to create a repository, which is a matter of just stitching up some Mongo magic, and create a controller that supports these guys. So what do we want on our blog? my default implementation was just a title and a description. So if we go into the com kickstart domain package, we'll look at the order to you see it's pretty simple. In this case, it extends abstract linkable entity, but it doesn't have to. Because we're going to store this in Mongo, it would have to, at the very least, extend abstract Mongo entity. So I'm just going to do that. Let's do a new class, blog, and I want abstract Mongo DB entity. So what kind of data items do we want on here? A title? Okay. What else? Is that it? Want anything else on there? That's a valid question, and I was just going to breeze over it, but I'm glad you brought it up, because Mongo provides us with a different paradigm. Because it is document oriented, we could choose to put the whole enchilada right in one document. We could have the root object blog, we could have entries, and then we could have comments all in one document. The problem with that is that we'd have some serious write contention if somebody's commenting on an entry way down here and somebody's trying to comment on another entry at the same time, and they have to write the document. Plus, depending on how big our blogs can get, that document would get that large, right? So we have to kind of just, it's design criteria. So basically, the flip side of it would be, what if we didn't care? What if we just operated on the collections independently and we just had a blog document, a collection of blog documents, a collection of entry documents, and a collection of comment documents? You could do, anything in between. Those are the two extremes. For this example, I probably would say let's just keep it simple and do the separate collections. And if we wanted to get more, if we have time, which doesn't look like we will, we could get fancy and start stitching them together. You buying my argument? Okay, so do we want any other data items on the overarching blog object? Anybody? Okay. All right. So one thing I am going to do is I'm going to do some validation here. So that'll make sure that when we create a blog, if we don't provide a title in the body, then we'll get a 400 bad request, title, blog title is required message. Okay? So that is some annotation magic provided by the syntax library. And there are there's string and numeric and double and those kind of validations. There's also a regex validator. You can also annotate it with validation provider and give it your own class, and it will call that class before in the validation.
So these are annotations provided by RESTful for Mongo?
It's provided by the syntax framework that's one of the micro frameworks in the RESTExpress package.
You mentioned earlier that you're also using Morphia. What's the relationship between Morphia and RESTexpress?
Morphia is just used for mapping these objects to MongoDB. We're not using the validation framework in Morphia because we also have repository patterns for Redis and Voldemort and that. So we needed a common validation. Yeah. All right, so the next thing we need to do is go into main, and you'll notice that this is significantly more crap in here because from the example one. So we're supporting JSON and XML with these custom serializers. We're also supporting a wrapped JSON and wrapped XML response, which I'll talk about later. Because sometimes, like if you're writing a JSON-based app, web app, you need more information coming back on the response than just the response code. Because if in the error case, a lot of JavaScript frameworks don't give you access to the headers and the HTTP code. They just send you down an error path. So if we wrap the response, we can still get that information and know what happened. Let's see here. Also, right here, this RESTExpress, of course, provides the ability to plug in preprocessors and post-processors. And here we're using a post-processor to set our last modified header for data stored in Mongo. That's why we had to extend that abstract MongoDB entity in our blog, because with that we get the Mongo ID, we get created at date and a last updated date in that inheritance hierarchy. And then RESTExpress can take care of, on GET requests, it can set the caching headers for everything going back out. So the combination of this last modified header post-processor and the cache control plugin, that takes care of our minimal caching headers for us. So if we go down here in the define routes method, you'll see the routes that we have for the default orders stuff. So I'm going to take the liberty of hatcheting that via comments. All right. So there's a lot of moving parts in creating a RESTful service. RESTExpress kind of minimizes that to the places that you really need to know stuff are when you're creating the DSL for the routes, the route creation, the DSL for the server creation, like this block here, and then the special operations on the request and the response that we'll get to in our controller. So I'm just going to create those two routes that we talked about. So we're going to give it our URI pattern, blogs dot format, bless you, config dot get blog controller, which we don't have yet, so we'll have to do that in a bit. And we wanted to support methods HTTP method get and HTTP method post. Oh, but in the get case here, it's kind of a read all scenario because we want to read all blogs, right? So I don't really like that, because if we string these together in the get method or in the method DSL specifier, whenever we do a get call on /blogs, it'll call the read method, which makes sense. But if we use the same blog controller for /blogs/id, that'll override the read method. So what I like to do is I like to have method post map to create, and then there's a separate DSL specifier called action, where you can specify which method it calls. So now, for this route, if we perform a get on this URL, it will call the read all method in this controller. And if we call post, it will call the create method in that controller. So then we'll just do the same thing, /blogs. Blog ID dot format. And for this one, we can just string the methods together. Get, put, all right. So this route supports get, put, and delete, and it will call respectively read, update, and delete method on that controller. So now we have to create this controller and implement all 4 methods plus read all. So create, update, delete. Get, read, update, delete, and create and read all. So if we go to the controller guy, we can look at the order controller. It's just a POJO. The constructor takes a repository. That's how we're going to write it to Mongo. Then we have a create method. And the signature is always the same, or the parameters are always the same, request and response, for those of you that write servlets. That's nothing new to you. The return value can be whatever you want it to be. RESTExpress will serialize it. If it's void, it'll return nothing. There's no real magic. In the case of create, this validation engine .validate and throw, that's the syntax piece. One thing I might mention is this project only has controllers. You'll find that as you flesh out your services that you'll want something deeper than that harbors your business logic or calls your business logic. So we create a service package. So we end up having, domain controllers and then a service layer underneath that. So we'd probably put these 2 lines down deeper in a service object. But for this example, and I didn't want to get too heavy. So anyway, this is some syntax magic. It's going to leverage those. It's going to leverage the annotation we put on our domain object, and it will throw a validation exception if if it's invalid. One thing I should mention is that you don't see any throw clauses on these because RESTExpress uses runtime exceptions. That's how it maps everything to. It will handle what's the opposite of a runtime exception? A watched exception. But we were just trying to reduce the amount of typing we had to do. Java's pretty verbose anyway, so we were trying to reduce that. All right, so we're going to mimic this. Let's see. Here's how we create our location header. We're going to, the request. Oh, I forgot to show you something. If we go back to this, our route, you can name each route, which in general, if you're going to do hyperlinking in your body, in your result, you need to name each route because in the route that gets called, in this case, if we were to call get on this route, that gets stuck in the request. So then passed along, so you can say, all right, I need to get this string so I can replace the ID and send it back out to the client. So in essence, let's do this. Read blogs collection. It's an arbitrary string, it doesn't really matter. But then over here in the controller, you can see this get named URL. Using the method get and then some arbitrary string, we can retrieve that URL pattern and do a substitution on it with the ID that we just created so that we can set the location header. So we can add a location header and give it a URL. And this is the Blarney that gives it that URL. There's link utils is in the RESTExpress package or in the RESTExpress project, but it takes the URL pattern that we defined in the controller, tells it what string piece we want to substitute, and then puts our new ID in it. And it adds that to the location header. And then we just return it for fun. Return the ID in the body. So let's just copy this guy. We'll call it blog controller. Change the lovely generics. Okay, so now it's feeling a little bit like shotgun surgery. Let's see what we got here. So this is, because this is meant to kick off a real project, we're kind of using best practices so that we're using constants across the route name for the route names and the parameter names in the URLs. So it looks like I need to kind of do this. So this blog ID parameter needs to match whatever I put here. All right, so let's get rid of that. We're not doing linking yet, so we'll get rid of that. So I'll tell you what I'll do here. I am going to go to our reference implementation, which you should also have if you got the files off the thumb drive. Let's go down here. So I have a blog controller here that I already implemented. And then if we look at the routes, that we have, because we're definitely, what time are we done here? So like 2:35?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to show you what we get for free by doing all this magic, and I don't want to, make everybody spend the time to do it. So part of the magic of RESTExpress is that everything's right here. You know what this service suite does right in the main file. I mean, you could, of course, abstract it out and put it in a routes Java or whatever you want to do, but we have found that much like with the Ruby on Rails app, if you go to the routes file, you know exactly what that service suite does. And this is the same thing here. As a maintainer, we're able to have different developers come in and pick up a service suite and know what it does because it's all right here. It's like, well, what routes does this support? Well, we got blogs. We know we can do a post and a get on that URL. And we do a get, put, delete on this URL. And we know because we do convention over configuration, if we go to this controller, we know what methods to look in already. There's no magic there. Well, there is magic there, but I mean, there's no ambiguity as to what the method is named. In this case, it's called read all. If it's not defined in an action DSL specifier, then we know it's one of the default ones, create, read, update, or delete. So, somewhat quick documenting for developers to maintain this stuff. From a controller standpoint, so we know exactly what method to go to if this is a post. Request.getBodyAs is going to marshal it into a blog class and assign it there. If it doesn't, if there's no body, it's going to say, hey, you didn't provide a body. It's just going to throw an exception. RESTExpress is going to handle that exception and set the HTTP status on the way out. Say, that's a 400. We get requiredness validation. We get numeric validation kind of for free. It ends up being a one-liner with the annotations. If the object is invalid that we're trying to create, throws an exception, and RESTExpress will send back a 400 and a message or a series of messages depending on how many validations fail. To create it, it's just going to write it straight to the repository. If there's one already there with that ID, or there's some something else, the repository layer will throw an exception. RESTExpress will set the appropriate HTTP status. We set a location header. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of code to create an object. We find. What's that?
A question on validation.
Sure.
Let's say some of these validations cannot be actually performed through the annotations. Like for example, when you're cross-linking attributes and verifying that they match. Like
Right.
address where state is not like that particular country.
Right. Yeah, syntax does semantic validation like that too. There's several ways you can do it. You can do it with an annotation and say that you can annotate it with at validation provider and give it your own validation class, or you can implement a validation method on the class itself, and the validation engine will call that method.
Okay. So if some validations come from the service layer.
Right.
So which cannot be defined as annotations in the domain, but it has to come from the service layer. How can we specify that, this is a validation failure, so that we can throw the appropriate HTTP status code back?
There's a exception hierarchy, of course. Validation error being the root, then you can implement your own validation errors, and then in RESTExpress, what you do is when you specify your server, you can map an exception, and all this does. This is how RESTExpress knows how to set the status, because RESTExpress has a hierarchy of exceptions. Service exception being the root, that will be a 500 if you just throw a service exception. Then there's other ones, bad request exception, conflict exception. Guess what? That's a 409. Not found, 404. So this is the throwable. You can map a throwable to any RESTExpress or service exception. That's how it works. So if you can get deep, like even in the repository or a service, and you just throw an exception, you can map it up here, and RESTExpress will send the message and the status code back as you define it here in this map.
I have some questions on this, not directly related to the example that you're showing. I don't want to derail your flow.
Okay.
So I can either put those questions and actually throw them back later.
Okay.
And we'll have 10 minutes or so.
Okay. All right. So another thing I want to touch on really quickly, in the read all method, because RESTExpress does support filtering, sorting, and pagination out of the box, in our read all method where we're reading all blogs. So we just parse things from the request and set it in query filter, query order, query range, and the repository automatically knows how to handle that. So if we send those 3 items, filter, order, and range, in the repository, it has a read all method. It will map that to a Mongo query that supports that filtering and pagination. Then, on the response for a collection like this, we're going to do set collection response that is, because if you're returning part of a collection, one of the cases you need to return what is it? I don't even remember now because it's like automatic. But if you return the whole collection, that's a 200 response code. If you return only part of the collection, like the first page or a page within the collection, that's a 206, I think, which means I gave you partial content, and then you have to set a range header. That's like, okay, range colon, I sent you this item 0 through 5 of 347. So this one line does all that. I'll say, okay, well, my collection is actually this big and I'm only returning this much. So I'm going to return a 206 and I'm going to set a range header that honors the HTTP spec. And I would like to show that if possible. So let's run this up the flagpole. That's not good. That's because I'm running it over here. All right, so I am going to ask for all the blogs, get a list of those. So I got an empty list, all right? You will see on the headers that I asked for a collection. So I did actually get the whole collection. That's why I got a 200. And I got a content range header of, I got 0 through 0 of 0 possible. So that means you got an empty collection. So let's create a new blog. So that means we should just be able to post to this URL. If we do a post, what happens? Oh, blog details not provided. So that syntax just validated the object, said, hey, actually that's that get body as request, and said there's no data in your body, so please provide a body. And by the way, the header is 400. Bad request. Bad request. All right, so let's give it a body. We'll do the minimal body here. We post to it. We got another 400. Blog title is required. So now that one is syntax kicking back on us. So if we provide a title, let's try that. All right, so it created it, and that's our ID right there. And we have a location header right here of the newly created object. So if we stick that up here, there's our blog with our title, and this implementation I added some links so we can navigate through the service if we wanted to look at its entries, or if we wanted to look at itself. So what I'd like to do is any special requests that I can play for you. Let's create a couple of more.
How did you get entries in there? Like, did you add?
Yeah, I'm using the complete implementation now just as a demo. So I have a complete blog entries and comments implementation. What I'd like to show you right now is let's create a few more blogs here. Post. Okay. And then 3 post. 3 should be good. All right, so if I do a get on that, I should get a collection of 3 blogs. And I do, okay? Blog 1, 2, and 3. The response headers, I got a 200, and I got 0 to 2 of 3 possible. So The content range was really originally spec'd for binary data. So this would be content range : bytes. You know, what number of bytes. That's why it's 0 based. So it ends up being a little bit confusing to me anyway when I look at that. But that tells me that I got 0 to 2 of 3 possible. So I got a whole collection, and that's why it's a 200. So let's take a look at if we wanted to like page through that collection. If it was, I don't really have time, but if we could create 100 of these, if I'd have created a script beforehand, I could have done that. But so let's say RESTExpress handles right out of the box. We can either do via query string or a header. It supports the range header or limit and offset query string parameters. So if I just said limit equals 1, so I only want 1 at a time. And let's just try that and see what we get. Okay, I got a 206, which means I only got a partial content, and I got items 0 to 0 of 3 total. So that means I got the first of my 3 items, right? So that should be blog 1. Hey, woo, it worked. Then, let's say we did offset equals 2. Let's do 1. There we got blog number 2, and we got item 1 to 1 of 3. So we got our second item. Let's do limit of 2 with an offset 1. So we got item 1 to 2 of 3. And we got blog 2 and 3. Okay, so out of the box, we get the pagination functionality without having to write a lot of code. How are we doing for time? Any questions before we adjourn? Anybody awake?